Hi everyone, welcome. As you can see, I've got a couple bins out here on the bench already, as well as some food for them. It's a variety of green beans, corn cobs. I've even got a lemon down there. Maybe a couple other things that I've forgotten about. The two systems are now 79 days of age and have been fed 6 times. And that last feeding, the 6th feeding, was 10 days ago. They're the European nightcrawlers. You might remember, if you've been here on my channel prior, that we found some unusual growth out on the edges of these bins. Both bins were affected by it. I believe it might have been bin number 2 over here, in which it was observed first, and then it popped up in the second bin. The first go around startled me, so I removed it. And then based on feedback from you, the viewers, I was, advised that it looked like stuff that the worms would not be harmed by and might actually enjoy eating. So on the second go around, we actually fed that stuff to the worms. No sign of it since, for a couple feedings now. So I think the panic is over. Not that there would have been a panic, because it was actually okay stuff. So I'm going to put on a glove, slip the second bin off to the side. We'll get to work on feeding the first one, then we'll get around to feeding the second one. They're both going to get fed today, so let's get to work. Interesting. I can see a number of these little tiny red mites, I believe they are, cruising the surface over here. I guess when we move the bin around, we sort of disturbed them and got them moving. Or maybe they were there, I just didn't notice them previously. For a while, I was putting mosquito dunks, or the BTI solution, into my systems as a preventative measure to try to eliminate the flying insects. And I did also notice that the partial side effect of that was that a far lower number of mites in my systems. But for a while I've been not applying this stuff because I ran out, and it also seemed like the flying insect situation that the stuff was there for in the first place was also a thing of the past. So I just put an end to applying the BTI solution to my systems until more recently, when I started seeing in some of my new bins that had never received any BTI yet, that there was a little bit of flying insect activity starting to occur there. So I've since returned to the use of my BTI solution, which I keep in this little squirt bottle here. So I think we're going to just get back to applying this stuff to most of my systems. So I've tried to make it into a practice of getting this stuff in here early on, so that before I start blending things in here, with the assumption that all the flying insects and whatever are kind of hanging out on the top surface, that this is the place where we're going to try to combat them with this stuff, because this stuff actually targets their offspring, their larvae. So it won't prevent them from getting in here. It won't prevent them from mating and leaving eggs behind, and it won't prevent the eggs from hatching either. But it's the little larvae that they're going to this stuff is eventually going to do away with, effectively cutting off the next generation. So I'm just struggling here. A lot of times I'll put a little drop of cooking oil down into the pump of this thing, since it does seem to jam up over time. And that's the only reason I'm applying this stuff so slowly. Some interesting looking fungi growing in here. So yeah, that mold that we saw growing, that slime mold, or dog vomit mold, or whatever it was called, did really well for a while. So it's not surprising that we're seeing other types of mold in here do pretty well. So now the last feeding they got 10 days ago was applied down the middle, and that's the reason there was a coffee filter here, indicating to us where we had last fed. And that coffee filter looked pretty beaten up, eaten up and beaten up. So I'm thinking we'll just include it with the bedding that we use to set up their reset feeding zone. A lot of times I like to just push this top covering of leaves that I apply on a pretty regular basis aside, just so I can really see what things look like beneath it. Things look pretty nice. Not a lot of worm activity here. I saw a couple, but not too many. Presumably they're down deeper within the system. Very nice and loose, flaky stuff. Almost like if it could benefit from a little bit extra moisture. All right, let's take a peek. The feeding they got last time was, I believe it was potato peels. So I'm not sure if that's the sort of thing we're going to find many leftovers of after 10 days. I mean, a lot of times they eat away the soft part of the potato peel, and then they leave behind just the peel, which might be a little bit tougher for them to break down. They're not going to, you know, walk away from that. They'll eat it eventually, but maybe it's just still a little bit too tough for them to eat up. So over time, that stuff will soften up too, and they'll be able to eat it. I can see worms all hanging out down here. See leftovers of the bedding that they've been getting with the feedings lately. So I'm trying to gauge how I like the moisture level down here. This looks like it would have been a piece of newspaper, kind of clumped up and not getting a whole lot of attention. I'm starting to wonder if maybe the addition of a little bit of moisture with this feeding might benefit the system overall. Because as much as I like the nice flaky texture of the stuff and the way it flows loosely, I feel like maybe the moisture level's a little bit lacking in here. So maybe it wouldn't hurt to perhaps apply a little bit of moisture along with the feeding that they get. Although I'll have to see, you know, because I make my prepared bedding with moisture, and sometimes it gets a little bit more damp than other times. So my idea was to include some of my prepared bedding, maybe. I'm looking at all this recycled bedding I pulled off the top surface. It might actually be sufficient, although, you know, I don't know why. Every time I find myself trying to talk myself out of applying more bedding, I try to cut myself off and say, you know what? Why am I trying to talk myself out of applying more bedding? We should just give them as much as they can eat. And even though they haven't eaten all this stuff, it's not surprising because it's out on the top surface. A little bit dry there, even though we've got plastic coverings. And that also makes me wonder as to why things might be a little bit dry. I think we might have observed dryness in the system because, or at least we theorized that it was because of the mold that was growing in here. And, you know, we saw traces of something, some sort of fungi growing on the top surface. So it is quite possible that there's still some fungi in here that's slightly dominating and taking over the moisture content of the material, but it's luckily not dangerous levels, or at least so it seems to me. Let me get some of my prepared bedding for this. It's shredded paper and cardboard mixed with leaves and moisture, and yeah, it's got a little bit of moisture content to it. Perhaps it's not quite as damp as I remembered. It was quite damp up until I came back into the collection of materials, because the collection of materials was omitting cardboard for some reason. I had set the mix up at one point previously with only newspaper and leaf bag, basically brown paper bag, and it seemed to me like I wanted some cardboard in there too, so I came back in later with cardboard, but I don't remember if I applied a lot of moisture at that time. I might have just gone with whatever existing moisture was in there and threw the dry cardboard in there. No, I probably did apply a little bit of moisture at least. So let's see if we can give these guys about half of what we bought down here. This was what I forgot. There's a couple pieces of bread down here. Now I think a lot of people had suggested that the reason we saw that bloom of mold in here was because we had provided some noodles. You know, to me noodles are basically the same as bread, right? It's just a different form. Starchy stuff. So I'm curious to see if maybe these pieces of bread are going to kick up some mold activity. And I bought down a few of these coffee filters, one of which I think we can set aside and use as a new replacement feeding zone indicator, since we're recycling the old one. So let's set one of them off to the side, and the other one could just simply rest in here as surplus bedding for this feeding. And oh, I almost forgot, I wanted to include some of this coffee that I bought down here too. And the coffee, I guess, is usually my segue into wanting to apply a little bit of my worm chow too. And don't worry, this is not all I've got. I've got a whole other jar, same size, full of it. So I went a little bit, not overboard, but you know, I went a little bit bigger the last time I prepared this stuff and made a whole lot more than I usually do. Now, I did start probing into the outer edges of the system where I felt like I saw a good bit of worm activity. So as we cover up here, we'll have the chance to examine the outer edges, assuming we didn't forget anything. Do I put grit in? You know what? Let's go for it. A little bit of grit too. We're not missing any of the vital ingredients here. We're going to give them bedding, we're going to give them grit, we're going to give them food. And maybe I should take a short break and just run upstairs and throw a little bit of lube into this pump here. Although, this stuff is really a bacteria, which in my mind is something that's just going to grow and spread a little bit within the system anyway. So I'm not certain it's important to put a whole lot in. As long as some is in there, then it'll get a foothold and make itself at home within the system and hopefully aid in the prevention of ongoing insect reproduction. Very nice and flaky down here, although not quite as damp as I thought it might be when we get in there to check. Sometimes there's these little bastions of moisture hiding in the systems, and I questioned or I wondered if maybe that's what we see out here on the edge. Now, the food we gave them, those green beans, could bring with them a little bit of moisture. That's true. The corn cobs, I'm thinking perhaps not as much. Oh, maybe this is where the worms have been hiding. So I am questioning whether I would want to apply any more moisture. That moisture that came in with the BTI solution, those few squirts, isn't really going to do much to change the moisture level here within the system. I don't know. I'm always torn because I do prefer to introduce moisture into my systems via the foods they're being fed versus just applying water. But I also don't want to stigmatize or create a taboo in my mind about adding water, because if it's necessary, then it should be applied for sure. I'm wondering what this is. It's interesting. Oh, that's what it is. Besides potato peel, there was a whole rotting potato that I chopped in half, and I tried to split it between the two systems, and this is one piece of potato that did seem to survive because of its size. It does seem like they're working it down. I'm just thankful that it doesn't have like a rotting smell to it, because if you ever smelled a rotting potato, you'll know it's the sort of smell that makes you want to run out of the kitchen and take cover. It stinks to high heaven. So I am gonna grab my water bottle. We're gonna just give it a little mild squirt down here. Why not, right? No harm in that, as long as we're not creating a big muddy mess, but it does feel like a little bit of moisture would benefit things here. Trying to remember if I put this thing away with pressure. It does seem like I did. It doesn't have to be a lot because I didn't want to apply too much stuff in here. This will just be our kind of excuse for rinsing off the edges of the bin and getting things nice and tidy here again. Alright, so a lot of people ask me, hey, why don't you just put the Beach Guy solution right into your water dispensing bottle, or why don't you just put the coffee in with your, with your worm chow, or why don't you just include grit with your worm chow? I don't know. I guess I like having all these things sort of individual ingredients so I can apply them as needed individually to the amounts that I see fit versus needing to use them in some sort of a predefined mix ratio. I don't know if that's really the reason. Whatever, I guess people just have their own personal preferences, and sometimes you don't even need to explain it, because sometimes you can't even explain it. It's just preference, personal preference. So we've, I think, applied everything we had to here. Food, grit, bedding, moisture, BTI. So I'm glad to see that things are looking pretty nice in here. Let's go ahead and get the other bin out here and get them fed. All right, here we are on to bin number 2. And, since these systems are being managed in a very similar way, almost like, clone copies of each other, this is when I feel like I can sort of pick up the pace, because I've done all the sort of exploratory, touchy-feely, sort of feeling the lay of the land stuff already to sense how things look and how I want to proceed. So I think here we can kind of move ahead just by more or less replicating what we did previously. You may have missed it, but yeah, that was the feeding zone indicator from last time. Not that bad, but still At this point, I'm thinking it might be better used as bedding to sprinkle down into the feeding area like we did earlier. And then they're going to get a nice fresh feeding zone indicator. And this is usually when I'm kind of on the lookout for anything that deviates from what I saw previously, because theoretically there shouldn't be too many differences in these systems if they're, you know, being managed in a way that attempts to keep them in sync with each other. I'm not sure. Maybe my first impression just by pulling stuff up here is just that maybe there's a higher concentration of castings in here, possibly caused by a greater number of worms hanging out in here. Difficult to say. That's the pumpkin stem we've been tracking, which means we'll also eventually bump into the cork, which is also in here. Here's that piece of potato, the other half of the potato that the other system got. Definitely looks like the worms are enjoying it. It's probably the last large chunk of food in here that's easily eaten. You know, large chunks of food like this go months and months, whereas the nice soft stuff, they're going to keep at it until it's all gone. Corn cobs are also going to take quite some time. So as I encounter the leftover bits, I'm just setting them aside a little bit. It looks like the inner hollow, well, it's not hollow. It is hollow now, but it wasn't hollow when we put it in here. There we go. The worms hollow it out. It does seem to me like the corn cob has like an inner material that's a lot softer than the rest, which the worms immediately gravitate towards and start working on because they can, saving all the slower composting portions of the cob for later. Gotta be careful, I'm already starting to spill stuff off the side here. That's one of the hazards of, I guess, working the way I do. A lot of people will just, like, you know, brush a little bit of material aside, plop the food in, cover it with bedding, and call it a day. Curious me, I just can't seem to help myself from wanting to explore what's going on. I guess there is a method to my madness, because I do like taking all this seasoned top covering bedding that was floating out on the surface and introducing it now to the feeding area, where it seems like it's going to get a lot more attention than if it just sat out on the surface. And, you know, I didn't add any more leafy material to the top surface on this go around. I am somewhat a creature of habit, but I also don't want to force myself into feeling like I've got a routine that I need to stick to. I like being able to kind of pick and choose my next steps versus feeling like I've got to follow a script. So I'm sure it's in here somewhere. I'm pretty sure that this is the system where we've got a cork floating around too, but I don't recall bumping into it. Perhaps we'll encounter it as we start covering things up, but I thought that it would have been down there with the rest of the foods in the feeding area. I probably just missed it. So let's see if we can replicate what we did previously. First we threw in the scraps of leftovers as well as the bedding. We set one of these coffee filters aside as our replacement feeding zone indicator, and the rest was all just yummy foods for them to nibble on and enjoy. So let's spread this stuff out a little bit, similar to how we had it. So here I am telling you that I don't have a script to follow, but I guess when I'm attempting to keep bins in sync to a certain point, it's at that point I feel like, yeah, we do kind of have a script of sorts, but it's really just defined by what we decided as the best course of action in the first system. So I at this point do feel like I want to follow a little bit of a script, simply because I am interested in maintaining a certain degree of consistency between my systems that I manage in pairs like these. So I'm questioning whether moisture is needed here. If the other system needed it, that was fine. And it's not one of the moisture is one of those things I don't feel like has to be applied from a consistency perspective. Totally applied on an as needed basis. Lots and lots of castings in here. I am getting that gut feeling that this system is somewhat more productive and possibly more densely populated than the other one. Even though we did try to, you know, evenly split the worms that were set loose into each of these systems. I accept the fact that my method of doing that is pretty, you know, I don't know, unreliable. Unreliable, is that the right word? I don't know. There's not a lot of control put into forcing or requiring an exact divvying up of the worms. I just give it a best effort, and then I assume that we're pretty close, and then I treat both bins as having equal populations. All right, here and there I just bump into another little chunk of corn cob. A while ago I took the corn cobs that I had for these little guys and I tried to cut them all up into little bits, because I know that that stuff really breaks down much more quickly when it's you know, cut up into little pieces. But more recently I've just been putting the corn cobs away as is after they've been eaten. I just put them in my freezer and then they get fed to the worms without all that extra prep work to chop them up. So do I put more moisture in it? It really doesn't feel like it's necessary here, so I'm going to skip that. Otherwise I think we pretty much covered all the bases here too, right? We put in bedding, we put in food, even worm chow, grit. So it's time to cover up and let them get back to work. Top covering paper here is getting pretty beaten up since it's still sort of one object, even though it's got a couple huge holes down the middle. We're going to keep using it, although perhaps next time it will be a good idea to just give that top covering paper a new mission and replace it, letting it go down into the feeding area as bedding for the worms. All right, everyone, that's it for today's check-in with our European night crawlers. 79 days of age at this point, I believe. Is that right? I had put all the numbers in my head and I was repeating them to myself. I think it was 79, 6, 10. 79 days of age. I could be wrong. 6 was 6 feedings. This is feeding number 7, and 10 days since the last feeding. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always... Oh boy, what's this? I'm sorry. Before we close shop here... Oh geez, what happened? I'm trying to figure out what the deal is with this little guy. Little caterpillar. All right. Once again, it's not one of the worm bin helpers that I consider as legitimate guests in my systems. And I'm not a bug expert either, so I'm not certain what type of an insect that was. But hopefully we're not going to see too much more of that. Whatever. All right, everyone. One more time. Let me try this again. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always very much appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.